Welcome to Kata Tips and Tricks, Episode 3, our final episode on this topic. In the last episode, we provided suggestions for the practice of the improvement kata. In this episode, we will offer several tips and tricks for the practice of the coaching kata. To recall, the coaching kata is a methodology to develop improvement skills and mindsets in others, who we have been referring to as learners. The methodology uses a series of questions that form a pattern for scientific thinking. So let's get started. Our first tip is to always conduct the coaching cycles at the storyboards, which should always be located near the focus process, the process that has been selected to be the focus for improvement. On occasion, I have seen coaching cycles performed elsewhere. The information that the learner needs to answer the questions that the coach will pose exists on the storyboard. As I often state, the coaching cycle is not a closed book test. The learner can read directly from the storyboard. This provides them with more comfort and confidence during the coaching cycle, which can be uncomfortable for newer learners. Think about it. Here comes your coach, who is usually your boss, asking very specific questions that you are expected to quickly answer. Most people would feel some amount of discomfort. Conducting the coaching cycle at the storyboard, which again should be located near the focus process, also allows for easier go see. Based on the discussion, the coach may suggest that he or she go with the learner to the focus process. The need to go see may arise for various reasons. Perhaps the learner is having difficulty grasping current or actual conditions. They may need assistance with timing the process or gathering some other process-related information. The coach may want to see firsthand the experiment itself. These are just a few examples. One of the most important tips involves the use of the coaching questions. Far too often, the coach follows and recites the questions on their coaching kata card, seemingly robotically. I say this because I observe coaching cycles. I do not see coaches properly responding to what the learner is actually saying. The coach often moves on to the next question when more discussion is needed on the current question. When I ask why the coach did not respond to a particular point that the learner brought up, the coach usually mentions the need to follow the card and the pattern that the questions represent. It is more about getting through the coaching cycle rather than really listening to the learner, recognizing gaps in the learner's thinking, and responding with proper coaching points. The coach should be carefully listening to the response to each question. There are things to look at or look for in the responses to each. We go over these in the University of Michigan's Kata program, and we mention several in the Improvement Kata tips covered in Episode 2 of this series. Things like making certain the learner is maintaining the grasp of the current conditions at all times, or developing hypotheses before conducting experiments. This just is to name a few. In addition, the coach needs to really listen to the learner. We must remember that at least half of language is unspoken. The coach should be noting body language, tone, and other cues in the learner's response to every coaching question. Based on what has been heard and observed, the coach should ask other follow-up questions as necessary. Then the coach can return to the pattern that the questions of the 5-question coaching card represent. Even the author, Mr. Rother, has begun to refer to the questions on the coaching card as a starter set. The coach can use other wording and, as I just mentioned, use other questions when necessary. The coach must remember that all of this is very emotional. The learner is experiencing emotions of confusion, stress, doubt, even fear, as well as others. The coach is also experiencing emotions of impatience, frustration, even anger can arise. The coach must be very patient with the learner, particularly with new learners. They cannot rush the coaching cycle, which can add to what is often a stressful situation for the learner. They need to keep a calm demeanor at all times, so that the learner feels comfortable and safe. The coach must be supportive and remember at all times it is about the development of the learner and not about getting things done and checking a box. The coach may have to provide more tangible support to help remove obstacles that the learner may have encountered. The message must be, we are in this together, and mutual accountability. The learner for improving his or her process, and the coach supporting the learner throughout. Another important tip involves the learner developing a target condition. People in general are reluctant to set goals and targets. Usually this is because they are concerned with not meeting them, the reaction that others, particularly the boss, might have, and even a general concern with the possibility of failure. Process improvement is a creative process. The practice of setting targets forms a gap and sparks the creative process. But if only the learner does not yet know how to achieve the target. The learner must move from his or her zone of certainty to a zone of uncertainty in order to spark innovation. Otherwise, they are merely accomplishing what they already know how to do. We say we want the learner to operate in the yellow zone as shown in this graphic. Now, there are two concerns here. One is that the learner sets too aggressive targets. This can lead to sustained disappointment and for some learners, a loss of will to improve. So we don't want learners to operate in a zone of mystery, as it says on this slide. Further, while we want learners to operate in a zone of uncertainty, a coach must be careful to listen to their learners, particularly with new learners. It may be desirable to allow early learners to operate in the zone of certainty, setting targets that the learner has good confidence he or she can reach. This is true of unconfident learners who are very reluctant to set targets. In time, they can set more stretch targets as they develop more confidence and skills. Continuing with the topic of Know Your Learner, we use the expression several times in this series, threshold of knowledge. It is important for coaches to help the learner identify his or her threshold each step of the process. After all, PDCA is a learning cycle. We experiment to expand our knowledge. One of the questions embedded in the 5 coaching questions is, what have you learned from taking that last step? We have found that the learner needs quite a bit of help at times to answer this question. As we mentioned in episode 2, there is a difference between the result of an experiment and what was learned. The coach often needs to draw this out from the learner by asking some more probing questions about the experiment just conducted. This is an important step because it is really necessary in order for the learner to design the next experiment. Learners need to maintain awareness of what they know as fact and conversely what they still do not know. Then they can identify the next step or experiment to close the gap of what they do not know. Our next tip involves the timing of coaching cycles. Really, they should happen naturally. The 5th coaching question asks, when can we go see what we have learned? The answer to this question will determine the timing. However, there are a few suggestions. If the learner is responding with a timing that is a bit excessive, more than a few days say, then the coach may want to suggest breaking the next step into smaller steps. This allows for more rapid coaching and learning cycles. Some organizations with whom I have worked have found it helpful to set regular coaching cycles, say weekly. They have found that leaving it to occur naturally is not resulting in regular progress with the experiments. The learner is finding difficult in completing the next step with the demands of other responsibilities that he or she may have. Setting a weekly cadence to the coaching cycles has helped overcome this obstacle in several organizations I have worked with. More than a few organizations have told me this, that's why I include it as a tip here. The Socratic method, teaching by asking questions, which the coaching Kata is based upon, is an excellent method to develop cognitive skills. However, a coach should not forget that there is another teaching method that they will need to use at times. I have run into my fair share of organizations that have taken the coaching Kata to an extreme. They believe that they must never give the answer or a direction to a learner. I have seen coaches attempt to teach a learner how to construct a run chart or to time a process through the use of questions. The coach must step out of the coaching kata and use traditional techniques to teach learners basic skills in the quality management tools, timing a process, interpreting patterns on charts, or even observing processes. One cannot ask enough questions to teach these skills. Of course, Lean provides a method for such instruction, referred to as job instruction, or JI, which dates back over 75 years. The coach will show how to do it, probably several times, then allow the learner to try it on his or her own, with the coach lending assistance as necessary. As I mentioned earlier, the coach needs to have the learner break down more lengthy experiments. I'd like to expand on this a bit. There are different types of experiments that vary based on their level of sophistication. There is the ideal experiment that scientists often practice. They have a hypothesis for the experiment that they're about to conduct. It is a fully conceived prediction of cause and effect. If I make this deliberate process change, this is what I expect to happen. Less sophisticated, but an experiment nonetheless, is where the learner makes a process change without a prediction of the effect. He or she simply wants to see how the process reacts. Practitioners of design experiments will recognize such an experiment. The results of the experiment or experiments will expand the learner's threshold of knowledge, which is what PDCA is all about. An even less sophisticated experiment is when the learner is simply gathering more information. This can involve more go see. It can involve continuing with an experiment to learn if the results observed are sustainable over time. This too is a valid experiment as it increases the learner's threshold of knowledge. The more rapid the learning and coaching cycles, the quicker the learner develops the requisite skills and mindsets for process improvement and scientific thinking in general. Learners sometimes have a tendency to too quickly judge the results of an experiment. They can grow quickly frustrated with when an experiment is not yielding the results expected, even in abandoning an experiment prematurely. Conversely, they may judge early positive results prematurely. The fact of the matter is that any change to a process will take some time to assess. I often say it will get worse before it gets better. Also, a change to a process will take time to fully assess. Just because a positive or predicted result is achieved once or twice doesn't mean it is sustainable. A coach will often have to help the learner to determine the appropriate time to assess the result of an experiment. When practicing the coaching kata, it is important that the coach not take over the process. In other words, it is imperative that responsibility for improving the process must remain with the learner. This transfer of responsibility can even happen unintentionally. The coach must be careful not to dictate the path. The next steps of the learner. Suggesting, why don't you do, or have you thought of, can be innocent on the surface, but can have unintentional consequences nonetheless. The learner can take these suggestions from the coach, who is often his or her direct supervisor or manager, as an order or command. At that time, the ownership of the process switches to the coach as the learner is simply doing the coach's bidding. I have seen this occur with Kata as well as A3 storyboards, where managers use the process to accomplish some preconceived objectives of their own. When I, as a second coach, bring this to their attention, they usually respond with some innocent, "I'm just trying to help," or "I'm just trying to hurry things along." These are not appropriate reasons. Now, I am not saying that a coach cannot provide information to the learner that may help, but he or she must be so careful when doing so. There is a fine line between providing information and providing direction. The coach is really trying to guide the thinking. Allow the learner to take a step, even if a coach believes, though usually is not certain, that it may not have a desired result. As long as the learner is experimenting safely, and as a result learning will be gained, it is all good. The 5 coaching questions have been referred to as process questions, with the process being process improvement. The supplemental questions that are part of the coaching kata, for example, what do you expect as a result of taking that step, are diagnostic questions, trying to develop cause and effect thinking and skills. If you are interested in learning more about these types of questions, I would suggest Edgar Schein's Helping book. Continuing on, the coach is looking for when the learner is drifting from the desired thinking. Then he or she can help direct the learner back. Examples of this include a target that is not aligned with the direction, the challenge, and vision. A learner who abandons or stops working on an obstacle when they encounter frustration, not when they scientifically prove an obstacle to not be an obstacle. A learner not using the learning from one step to determine the next step or experiment. These are just a few examples. A coach must always remember that there are multiple paths to a destination, and not just the one he or she thinks is best. The fifth of the 5 coaching kata questions asks, when can we go see what we have learned? The coach must remember that once the learner responds, a verbal contract has been formed. The coach must respond accordingly. If the coach misses an appointment, so to speak, it can send a very negative message. Enough missed coaching cycles and the learner can become discouraged. If the coach doesn't care, why should I, they might say. I have heard this too many times and why I include it here as a tip. Too often with organizations practicing kata, I see this tendency for parochial or localized thinking. I mentioned this in episode 2. There is a tendency to believe that only experiments that involve the learner with no involvement of others are allowed. As I said during that episode, this is simply not true. Expanding on this local thinking, often is the case that the learning a learner is acquiring can benefit others in the organization. The coach, usually a manager, who has a broader perspective of the organization, might want to have the learner share their learning with other areas. The learner can review their storyboards to achieve this socialization of learning. This can work the other way as well. Perhaps in another area, important learning might benefit a particular learner in another area. The coach can arrange such interactions. For nearly 30 years, the expression the learning organization has existed thanks to Peter Senge, who wrote a groundbreaking book on the topic. Capturing and sharing learning should be an objective of any organization. This brings episode 3 and our series to a close. To recall the key points from this episode. Number 1, don't be robotic. Listen to your learner. Don't simply go through the coaching kata questions, but really listen to the responses and respond accordingly. Be flexible with regard to the coaching cycles. Ideally, coaching cycles are daily or near daily, but some organizations have found regular weekly cycles to be helpful as well. Number 3, traditional instructional methods still apply. The coaching kata uses a series of questions. It is one method of teaching. Traditional methods of showing are effective for teaching other skills. A coach must use both. Number 4, know your learner and adapt accordingly. This is true for any learning. Be flexible based on the willingness of a learner. A coach does not have to be so careful in wording and the like when dealing with a willing learner. More care must be given to reluctant learners. Number 5, do not take ownership of the process, even unintentionally. The coach is to help the learner to improve his or her process or processes and develop his or her skills and mindsets while doing so. Number 6, convey, we are in this together. Improvement is an anxious activity. The level of anxiety will vary based on the learner. Support from the coach will really help the learner until he or she develops confidence. Okay, to wrap up our series, as I said in the first episode, Kata filled an important void in the continuum of improvement methodologies that organizations were practicing. It has helped organizations move beyond facilitator-led projects, events, and the like. It has provided a systematic approach to practicing continuous improvement, where the rubber hits the road, with frontline and middle management leaders working with their natural work groups. In this way, organizations can create the culture of continuous improvement that they seek. I hope that you found the information provided in this series helpful. While our tips and tricks series are intended for people with some experience in a topic, I recognize that often the viewer is new to a subject. So if you're interested in gaining more information and experience, I would suggest the University of Michigan's Kata for Daily Improvement Workshop. It is offered several times a year and even on site at organizations. Through experiential learning, participants get to practice and begin to develop their skills and mindsets. Perhaps you want to check it out. And of course, you can read the 3 books that the author has on the topic. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.